My background is visual neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. And essentially I've been for 25 years or so trying to understand how we process information, but particularly how we process what I call dynamic scene information. In other words, how you cross streets, how you drive cars, things like that. And it seems obvious, it's automatic for us, but these are less than automatic processes. I mean, they have evolved through practice, and of course there's predisposition. So what happens when you start aging? You know, normal aging. We're still healthy, we're still okay, our brains are still functioning relatively well, hopefully, thankfully. But things change, and it has an influence on our behavior. It has also an influence on our well-being, because we don't do the things the same way, we don't feel the same confidence. So one of the issues I tried to do is to sort of take these principles that I was doing in more basic science, the traditional research perspective, then did a first quantum leap. In 1999, I remember, because I got a large infrastructure grant from the Canadian government. And my justification for that was to build immersive rooms, okay? And of course, my colleagues in the visual domain said, "Are you crazy? You can't control that. You know, this is too big, it's expensive," and so on and so forth. But my justification was that even if I put all the pieces of the puzzle together and I try to understand what mechanism is responsible for seeing an object, what mechanism is responsible for tracking an object, what mechanism is responsible for interpreting the object, I would never live to see the end of it. And from my perspective, virtual reality at the time, now is a buzzword, but at the time was almost undoable for research in human behavior perspective, I thought was the way to go. And so I justified it that way, and they believed me. So that's where it started. So it started there, and early on, first intentions was to sort of take what the brain does from a perceptual perspective and cognitive perspective when they're dealing with dynamic scenes. What are the fundamental properties that I can isolate there? Because if I can't isolate them and I can't actually interact with them, there's no way I can transfer that, and it's not scalable. Right? So at the time, it was obvious that I had to pose these questions. So I sort of identified a few basic elements, which is nothing new, it's just a recipe. It was the recipe that I thought was necessary to sort of address these systems that I can actually act upon and then hopefully will transfer into real life situations, which has been our focus all the way through. And that's what we call now the NeuroTracker. You see some examples out there. It's scalable now, thank God for all the technology development and the Oculuses and the Googles and everybody else who's working on this and make this, you know, like the next Apple iPhone, you know, of virtual reality, because that's going to make it accessible to everybody else. So essentially, I wanted to make sure that grandma could cross the street without killing herself or killing someone if she's driving. So, and that's not an obvious problem, and it's a performance issue. Performance. So we talked about performance. So this is where the global encapsulating word, if you will, of a lot of the activity of Cognizance and NeuroTracker. So I was interested in the performance of my grandmother, or my mother now, essentially, and the performance of elite athletes, because I also have an interest in athletes. We started working with athletes. Then I got a funny phone call from a funny company or a funny club that's from your neck of the woods called Manchester United. They heard about what we were doing. They were interested in. I'm still embarrassed to say that I did not know who they were at the time. But when I talked to my postdocs who come from Europe, I saw the facial expressions change, so I figured I should call them back. And this sort of got us initiated in what we, sort of the assessment of real world situation. How can it be used with this group? How efficient can it be, with this population who is at the high end of the performance scale? And then the next question is, how much of an influence will it have on their real performance, what really matters for these people? And that is sort of the approach we've been using now for everything, because the things that we never predicted would be influenced by this behavior, by this approach, by this intervention, things like attention, all of the nice things that were mentioned in the first two talks this morning, and three actually, are so relevant to what we've been doing. How you switch from precise focus, and how you have to at the same time have this versatility in your attention and cognitive systems when you're dealing with real life situations. That's exactly what this little exercise does, and it does it in 5-minute bits. It's like the power training for the brain. It's very short, very brief, content free, because that's the whole idea about scalability. Now, if I start, ultimate training of something is doing that activity. So if I'm asking somebody, I want to make you a better basketball player, you play basketball. But they can't play basketball all day. They can't play basketball every day. The load on the injury and on the physical strain, everything else. So you have to find some way to sort of take that content out, because that's not what we want to address, and make sure their brain is rightly set up to actually engage in that content, and make better decisions. This is what we believe we've done with this simple approach.
That's great. Jocelyn?
Yes, well, of course, our technology is an immersive type technology. So, well, it's a virtual reality type technology. So there is that experiential element that's there from the start. And if you think about, enhancing brain function, often you think about, we saw some nice examples this morning about games and stuff. It's either games or something relatively boring, so like, repeating certain tasks over and over again, so you don't get that feel. But we did do some gamification initially. We developed some interactions where we have, especially with the teams, one of the first things we did was build a collaborative versus competitive condition, because they're extremely competitive. You can imagine that. One of the issues we had was we weren't, allowed to discuss the results and everything else. The first thing the guys did when they came out of the room, I got the score. What did you get? Right. That's the first thing. So we're sitting there and going, okay, no control over this. So it's in their nature, but it's in everybody's nature in some way, shape, or form. I think the way to sort of, one of the things that's really nice about, I think, this dynamic approach of using the NeuroTracker is the fact that you see results right away. It's very short, and it's a very brief exercise, about 5-6 minutes, and that was critical too. So how to sort of pack it into short bursts and still get some tangible results, and over relatively short periods. So if you think about most of the stuff that's been, the research that we've published, was done with a total training of about 90 minutes. It's just dispersed training. And we show that if you do a compacted training, it just doesn't work. So this little dispersive thing, you don't get the, often when you have to rotely go over and over and over and over again, there's some benefit to that in certain circumstances, but doesn't necessarily, the benefit doesn't necessarily equate the amount of time you're putting in. So that's one thing. So clearly you see these graphics coming up. It's instant. You can see your progress or degress.
Right.
If you had a night that's a little too, arrosé, as we say in French, the night before, it will show up on your results. So this is kind of nice, so you can actually see whether, this corresponds or not with your behavior. So these kinds of things, I think, are incentive. When it comes to children, that's for, adults, us adults. But for kids, it's one of the amazing things, like, it wasn't the original plan. We're sort of addressing issues like autism and things like that, but I've done a lot of work in that area. And so I didn't know if there would be plastic to this kind of thing, but actually they are quite a lot. And in fact, one of the things that's hard for some of these populations is engagement. It's one of the difficult things. They can't attend for very long at certain things. And we sort of participated and showed it to some of these children, and in fact, some of them, we couldn't take them out. So it's one of those things. So it'll vary with who we're dealing with and so on, but I think the fact that getting immediate feedback, accessibility, and now, many different platforms is the way we've been working on.
Right, so you sell NeuroTracker into multiple different verticals. You've got an
Yes.
education focus, you've got a high performance focus that the Navy SEALs use.
Exactly.
You've got other verticals. Do you customize those versions?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. So what we do is, really the basic exercise is always the same, and that's really the scalability issue. And it has to be that way. Otherwise, I think that was the idea originally, not to develop a game for each specific or an approach for each specific task. But it's built in such a way that somebody can construct their own, their own interests, can build on top of it, the scalability of multitasking. So we have one approach that we call tactical awareness. And this was really at the demand of the special forces here in the US, that we did a lot of that. where the basic technology, so you have the basic exercise, and you can layer on top specific, their content-specific issues, whether it be, recognizing particular elements of danger or security, or whether it be making a rapid decision about, somebody's facial expression, and these are all important in the context of action. And so we overlay these elements, and what you see is the results from the NeuroTracker actually are sort of give you a gauge of how much engagement that specific task is requiring. And now it's actually being used as like a level of how much effort is required for your expertise level. So see, totally different twist that we hadn't predicted initially. So that way it's customized. If we can give you an open platform where people can add these elements, especially when we're dealing with special forces where we some of those are closed systems, so we don't know what they're doing. So we give them the right tools so that we show examples, and then they actually go ahead and they build their own. So we don't know exactly what they're doing with some of these things, So, but we gave them that's how we made it different and adaptable for the different contexts.
Great. Yeah.
And for children, just one last thing, we had to adapt even the specific approach, because the way it works is you have to sort of track a certain number of elements dynamically. Now, obviously, if you're early in the development, or if you have severe brain damage or something, if you've had a severe impact on brain, you're not at that level. You've had stroke or something. So we have a quick ramping up process now where you start with different levels of targets just to get you at a level where it's workable. So that way it's been adapted too.